And on the subject of monolithic political forces, we do have one more thing to discuss. We don't have too long, unfortunately, but it concerns the Pope and the Pope's unprecedented attack on cancel culture. He is, of course, the leader of the Catholic Church and as a result, probably the most powerful institutional figure in the Christian world, but he's been observed on many occasions to have been a little bit woke, as popes often go. We can get a summary of this from his Wikipedia page, which shows that he's maintained his traditional view of the church regarding abortion, clerical celibacy, and the ordination of women, but has initiated dialogue on the possibility of diaconesses and has made women full members of dicasteries in Roman Curia. He maintains that the church should be more open for members of the LGBT community. In international diplomacy, he's helped restore diplomatic relations between the US and Cuba and supported the cause of refugees between the European and Central American migrant crises. So he seems like a socially progressive pope. Not all of this is bad, of course. I would argue that restoring diplomatic relations between the US and Cuba certainly isn't bad, and refusing to make a demagogue out of capitalism and consumerism isn't necessarily bad either, given that they both come to the detriment of nations and morals in general. But anyway, he's been, if we move on to the next one, he's been particularly critical of the EU's handling of the migrant crisis, basically saying we should do more to accommodate the refugees, I suppose, unilaterally. And if we move on to the next one here, he has continued to argue against same-sex marriage, but advocating for same-sex civil unions, which, to be perfectly honest, is probably as liberal as you can probably be allowed to get as the leader of the Catholic Church, being that under the Catholic doctrine, gay relationships are referred to as deviant behaviour, so there's not really a lot of room for interpretation.
Yeah, you sort of got a book. I mean, this is the thing with wokeism, it's progressive, so, you know, the tenets of wokeism change all the time. You know, what was good. So J.K. Rowling at one point was completely, you know, right on and a model woke citizen, and then, you know, the shifting sands expose her as an alleged transphobe, which she obviously actually isn't. But yeah, I mean, the thing with your traditional religions, so wokeism's a new religion, but the traditional religions, they've got it all written down on bits of stone.
Yeah.
So you can't really really change. You can't really deviate that much from the bits of stone.
No, and civilizations have been built and sustained on their tenets. There's much more to lose from attacking religion than there is, I suppose, attacking wokeness, which is like an emergent religion, you could say.
The weird thing is, though, like, woke people are always absolutely certain that their woke beliefs are the right beliefs, even though the woke beliefs are going to be different in a couple of weeks' time.
Yeah, as certain as the Westboro Baptist Church are about the sins of the American soldiers. Yeah, which and they're just as much fanatics as anyone else, really, when you put it that way. But it does seem that Pope Francis has beginning to see the devil where it actually exists, in woke cancel culture, and he expressed this as part of his annual State of the World address to diplomats, which is covered by the New York Post here. And it says Pope Francis took aim at cancel culture, warning of the perils of those trying to rewrite history with dangerous one-track thinking. He made scathing remarks during his annual State of the World address to diplomats, enunciating cancel culture in English during a long speech, otherwise in Italian. Without giving specific examples, that must be noted, he attacked agendas increasingly dictated by a mindset that rejects the natural foundations of humanity and the cultural roots that constitute the identity of many peoples. Pretty based, I would say. What could he have in mind, I wonder? I think we both already have a relatively good idea. Probably intersectionalism, the entire philosophy of intersectionalism, which of course is the gateway ideology I've tried to articulate many times to paedophilia, bestiality, racial and abstract gender essentialism, which basically the formula for pretty much every bad idea that has ever existed. So the Pope is basically saying, without actually saying it, so he obviously, we can't speak for the Pope here, even though, of course, the Pope likes to speak for God when he's not elected as overseer, that biology is real, biological sex is real, and the very idea of separating sex from gender maybe is a bit farcical. And perhaps suggesting the idea that a young girl, because she may have, for example, or perhaps be predisposed to wear, shall we say, boyish clothes, may not necessarily be a trans man as a result.
Well, yeah, and like, somebody commented on one of my YouTube videos saying, I'm a gay man, and I would have been, you know, I'd questioned my gender when I was a young teen, so I would have been sort of put into that process to transition. I'm so glad I didn't transition because I'm a man, but I'm a gay man, and you know, I think there's a lot of the current fashion is for everybody that, you know, displays any sort of gender questioning or whatever to sort of almost be funneled into that process. Once you start the steps in that process, it's hard to step out or reverse it. But I've got to say, man, all this like, you know, biology and gender is the same thing. It's not the same. Like, a man isn't a man just by being male. You got to like kill stuff. You got to fire the gun. You've got to have been in a fight. You got to drink like whiskey. There's loads of stuff you've got to do. You got to have bought a fridge. There's lots of stuff you got to do before you're considered a man.
Yeah. Though when genderqueer theorists say that, but this is performative and not actually rooted in anything essentially male, do you think that's entirely true? Yeah. Because I would argue that actually all of these things are natural expressions of the division of labour between men and women. Like, as I think that I am quoting Mary Beard here, I'm afraid to say, but men are like the penetrators, women are the kind of the receivers, and she's being very, very literal in describing this, of course. But there is a philosophy.
Mary Beard, of course, is a pornographic film director.
That's put it nicely. But basically, you could say that there is a symmetry between the two. Yeah, and that. I suppose the inherent dispositions of one is always going to be mediated somewhat by the other, and from then you actually have kind of, you could say, extensions of the way that they behave in the real world that have rational correspondence to that sex. That's always been my argument. It's not the argument that feminists make, but I get the impression that when he talks about these kind of unhuman forces trying to deform nature, he's appealing to this sort of thing. Or at least suggesting that weird progressivism is going too far with it. Yeah, and he actually goes on to address what I think is this, what could be perceived as an attack on nationhood and the rewriting of history. And he goes on to say, I consider this a form of ideological colonization, one that leaves no room for freedom of expression and is now taking the form of the cancel culture invading many circles and public institutions. Yeah. Under the guise of defending diversity, it ends up counselling all sense of identity with the risk of silencing positions, he warned. And he goes on to say, a kind of dangerous one-traffic thinking is taking shape, one constrained to deny history or, worst yet, to rewrite it. And I don't think that he could be more explicit about actually being explicit here, because we all know that there is this ongoing attempt to reconfigure the entire West's history into like a dialectic of white supremacy. Yeah, which of course we're not pretending that white supremacy never existed. We know perfectly well that of course it has, and there are niche groups very much committed to the idea of white supremacy. What's being contested is ultimately what has caused it. What Black Lives Matter are ultimately trying to do, and this is pretty much unashamed, and they're shameless in their gaslighting tactics, which we don't have time to go into today. But everything fractured about the West, every single social class that exists, is somehow as a result of this ideal of white supremacy. Yeah, and that demands a radical revision of everything that we value, because if you're going to take like whiteness as essentially bad in that way, then you end up at the conclusion that in order to have an equal society that the American founding fathers actually wanted, or absolute equality, if you like, or equity in their case, the only way to achieve that, and Robin DiAngelo is explicit in this, is to subjugate whiteness itself. Yeah. So it's removing the individual rights to actually forcibly redistribute. Yes. I mean, it's essentially communism. And where you end up with that is basically communism. Yeah, but it's racial essentialism is what it is. Yeah. It's I mean, you couldn't get more segregative than that. Yeah. I mean, that's literally the opposite of, actually, it's the opposite of what communism actually wants, really, because communism is post-racialist. Yeah, yeah. It only acknowledges class divisions. As soon as you abolish class divisions, then they were all basically in this rainbow together to the communists. Yeah. What Black Lives Matter are trying to do is worse than that, in that they want this economic equity, but they still want racial they seem to just want racial segregation. You can only achieve the equity through segregation. Yeah. And the real sinister part of this, and this is why I thought I'd credit the Pope here for his comments, is that where you end up is basically saying that, well, ethnic minorities assumed to be on the receiving end of white supremacy can look at their history and be proud of who they are, of what they've come through. Mm-hmm. But the white person, who has absolutely nothing to do with that history, no knowledge of it, has no intent back at that time because they weren't even born, has got to hate who they are, hate their history, so that they're basically denied a social good that everyone has. That, by definition, cannot be equality, because that's a social good that you're denying to one particular group on the grounds of race. And so it is basically racism presenting itself as anti-racism.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that this could be the devil doing its work through identity politics.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Anyway, that is my theological claim for the day. But yeah, he does seem to be to have finally come around to the gaslighting tactics, and I'm very glad that he has. I'm just scrolling down here. He has been, well, the former. If we could actually get the the GB News clip up, because we are running a little bit short of time. His comments have been, for the most part, very well received. Former chaplain to the Queen and Anglican Bishop Dr. Gavin Ashenden praised the Pope for his comments on cancel culture, and I think it's pretty much the reason for doing so is obvious on Christian terms, really. Like, the self really is sacrosanct, conscience is sacrosanct. We act in a way that, or at least we're encouraged to act in ways that not only that we would to ourselves, but in ways that actually kind of improve others as well as ourselves at the same time.
Yeah.
And to basically subject ourselves, as I suppose identity politics does, and which cancel culture tries to actually do at a political level, to almost censor people from being able to make their own judgment on what good and evil amounts to. It's finally, what I'm trying to say, it's finally good that a Christian has actually stood up, and the most powerful Christian in the world of that, to actually say that you know what, we need to recourse to our conscience a little bit more. And it isn't that's a principle that not only, I think, should of course committed Christians take to heart. That should be recognised as a concrete universal. If the West cannot accept that, it's pretty much lost its entire fabric, I think.
If you want to see more from the podcast of the Lotus Eaters, you can go to lotuseaters.com to enjoy all of the premium content we have on the site, such as this premium article by me, exploring how inclusivity is in fact the most exclusionary belief system of all time. If you prefer to listen to our articles rather than read, we have an audio track recorded by our external reader, John Crow, available to Silver Tier members. You can get access to all of our premium content with a Bronze Tier membership for just £5 a month. If you'd like to stay up to date with all the content we're putting out on the site, you can follow Lotus Eaters on Getter as well at getter.com. You can also follow our individual writers and presenters, such as Harry here. Thank you, and goodbye.